culture of American suburbs. Now from the Young America's Foundation Freedom Fest Conference, Dinesh D'Souza, author of Letters to a Young Conservative. The program is an hour.
Dinesh D'Souza is a fantastic speaker and a wonderful, wonderful advocate, especially to young people. Dinesh is also the Robert and Karen Rishwain Research Fellow at the Hoover Institution. He has been called, quote, one of the top young public policy makers in the country, end quote, by Investors Business Daily. His areas of research include the economy, society, civil rights, affirmative action, cultural issues, and higher education. He's had a number of best-selling books, including the New York Times bestseller, Illiberal Education, The End of Racism, What's So Great About America, The Virtue of Prosperity, an extraordinary collection of books. My favorite, as Executive Director of Young America's Foundation overseeing the Reagan Ranch, is his wonderful, wonderful book about Ronald Reagan, how an extraordinary man became an extraordinary leader. And if you have not read that book, I just really encourage you to do it. It's a fantastic book. Dinesh's writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Times, Vanity Fair, Forbes, Harper's, Atlantic Monthly. And currently he is working on, I guess, an anthology, the best that has been thought and said on multicultural reader. And Dinesh earned his BA in English from Dartmouth in 1983. He served as a senior domestic policy analyst during the Reagan White House years and was one of the founders of the Dartmouth Review. And this morning we're going to hear him talk about his latest book. And Dinesh, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to the podium of Freedom Fest.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. I thought I would begin with a story that involves Winston Churchill. As the story goes, Churchill was on his way to Parliament, and because he was about to give a long speech, before he got there, he decided to make a stop at the restroom. And as he was at the restroom, who should walk in but his political rival Clement Attlee, who comes and stands right next to him. And Churchill is a little chagrined, and he moves a few counters down. And Attlee looks over and says, my, Winston, are we being a little modest? And Churchill says, well, not at all, Clement. It's just that whenever you see something that is large, private, and working well, you want to nationalize it. I tell you this story in part to illustrate the ways in which our world has changed over the past few decades. My mission this morning is to talk a little bit about my book, Letters to a Young Conservative, a book that is a kind of battle manual for conservatives and libertarians, particularly young conservatives. It's a book that tries to show how one can be a conservative in a liberal environment or in a liberal culture. Because if we think about it, the conservative is in a kind of dilemma. If you're on a liberal campus, if you inhabit a liberal culture, you cannot be a conservative in the traditional sense. Think about it. The job of a conservative is to conserve, to hold on, to maintain. But if you are a conservative in a liberal culture, what do you conserve? Do you conserve liberalism? So my point is that in that situation, a conservative has to some degree, stop being a conservative, which is to say, one should be intellectually or philosophically conservative, but temperamentally, strategically, you have to become a bit of a radical. And by that I mean you have to not simply preserve or sustain, you have to actually challenge and undermine and subvert. You have to become a kind of guerrilla attacking the assumptions of the liberal culture that you happen to inhabit. You know you're being successful as a conservative in a liberal culture if you are in a situation in which the liberal sheep cannot graze unmolested. And so if I were to summarize the mission of the book Letters to a Young Conservative, it is to give young people ammunition, a kind of strategy, if you will, to molest the sheep. Now, what I want to do today is to draw on some of the themes of the book to show three ways in which our world has changed. Because by understanding the changes, we can try to formulate a strategy for dealing with them. Earlier I mentioned the idea of nationalization. And that word has become somewhat antique. And the reason for that is that the great debate of the 20th century, which was a debate between capitalism and socialism, or one could say a debate over the idea of collectivism. That debate has to some degree, at least intellectually, been settled. Nobody talks so much about nationalization anymore. Nobody talks that much about the Marxist idea of surplus value. The debate has shifted. This is not to say that capitalism has won the debate. Rather, I would say the debate has shifted from a debate over the efficiency of capitalism to a new debate over the morality of capitalism. Capitalism has defeated socialism as a way to generate wealth and affluence. That's pretty much conceded. Even the anti-globalization, the anti-free trade, the anti-outsourcing, the guys who are attacking capitalism today aren't saying that it undermines efficiency. Part of their argument is that it is efficient. It is efficient in their view, but unjust. It is efficient, but immoral. And so capitalism now is facing a new enemy, an enemy that concedes the effectiveness of capitalism, but attacks, if you will, its justice, its morality. I mentioned this change to pass quickly over it. I want to focus on the other two great changes in our society. The second one that we've seen over the past few decades, and more particularly now, is that Islamic radicalism or Islamic fundamentalism seems to be replacing Soviet communism as the main challenge facing America and indeed facing the West. Now, at first glance, if you try to evaluate this shift, it seems like if you compare the Islamic world to the old Soviet empire, it seems like a very inappropriate comparison. Remember, the Soviets had a massive arsenal of nuclear weapons. But I think we're seeing that the Islamic world has something today that the Soviet Union, especially toward the end, did not have. And that something, of course, is true believers. By the time the Berlin Wall fell, if you wanted to find a true believing Marxist, you would have to go to the Department of Romance Languages at Duke University. Not too many of them left in the Soviet bloc. The presence of the true believer, we saw it in 9/11. We see it in Palestine. We see it even in Iraq. The suicide bomber is, in a way, the representative, the classic example of the Islamic true believer. And in trying to understand this new situation, I thought it might be helpful to step back from the current controversies and try to see what's going on in a larger sense. Islam, in a way, is one of the oldest and arguably one of the greatest civilizations in history. The history of Islam is very different than the history of the West. Unlike Western civilization, and by Western civilization I mean the civilization built on Athens and Jerusalem, in a sense on classical reason and on Judaism and Christianity. But unlike Christianity, which began in defeat with a Christ on a cross, with the early Christians hounded and persecuted, Islam began in victory. The Prophet Muhammad was in his own lifetime not only a prophet, but a Caesar. And the roles of church and state, or church and government, were from the beginning united in Islam. Islam began to establish from its early years a large and growing empire. The Muslims defeated the Sassanid dynasty in Persia. They overran the Byzantine Empire. They established a kind of global civilization stretching across 3 continents, Europe, Asia, and Africa. In fact, arguably, Islamic civilization in the Middle Ages was the only global civilization. You had other impressive civilizations, the civilization of China, for example, but that was confined to one pocket of the world. The Muslims were trying to bring the whole of the inhabited world under their orbit. In fact, between the 15th and the 16th century, so large and powerful was the Islamic empire that you simultaneously had 5 Islamic empires functioning simultaneously. You had the Safavid dynasty in Persia, now Iran, the Mamluk sultans in Egypt, the empire of the great Khans in Central Asia and Russia. You had the Mughal Empire in India. You had the Ottoman Empire based in Turkey. So Islam was rich, it was powerful, it had worldwide exploration, it was advanced in culture and literature and so on. And then something very odd and unexpected happened. Western civilization, then called Christendom, which was a relative backwater, began to advance. In other words, in one of the great seesaw movements in history, Islamic civilization began to plummet, and Western civilization began to gain economically, politically, militarily, and so on. And how did this happen? I mean, to this day, you have a debate about why Islamic civilization went down, why Western civilization came up. One conventional answer, which is given in a lot of our multicultural classes and textbooks and so on, taught in our schools and universities, is that Western civilization succeeded, became affluent, because it was oppressive. Western civilization invented slavery and colonialism and imperialism and subjugated other cultures, stole their stuff. Now, it seems to me the problem with this explanation is it begs the question of how Western civilization, which began poor and weak, was able to subjugate and defeat these other cultures. I think that the reason for the great strength and dynamism of the West is that Western civilization invented some new things that never existed before. And 3 of those things are science, democracy, and capitalism. All those 3 things are based on some universal impulse. For example, to take science, everybody wants to learn. The Chinese record the eclipses, the Mayans develop a calendar, the Hindus invent the number 0. But science, by which I mean laboratories and checking and verification, what Whitehead called the invention of invention, the scientific method. This is a Western idea. And the same is true of capitalism. People in every culture want to trade. There's nothing Western about money, but capitalism, by which I mean property rights and contracts and courts to enforce them and limited liability companies and credit and insurance and double entry bookkeeping, the whole ensemble of institutions embryonically outlined by Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. This is a Western idea, and the same is true of democracy. So it is the internal symbiotic relationship, the dynamic interaction between science, democracy, and capitalism that accounted, in my view, for the great rise and strength of the West. And we saw that, of course, time after time on the battlefield. Starting in 1683, when the Turks who laid siege to Vienna, were defeated. And continuing through the 18th century, the 19th, and now today, Islamic civilization has had a series of catastrophic reversals. And today it is arguably in its worst situation ever. Because if you subtract the influence of oil, isn't it a fact, a regrettable fact, but a fact nevertheless, that if you remove the influence of oil, Islamic civilization would join sub-Saharan Africa as a relatively unimportant, economically unimportant, politically unimportant part of the world. Now, interestingly, the Islamic radicals, the Islamic fundamentalists, they know this. They accept it. There is a great debate over why this has happened. And the Islamic radicals have an interesting explanation for it. What they say to the man on the Arab street is, look, if you read the Quran, it promises you that if you follow the will of Allah, the teachings of the Quran, you're going to have prosperity in this world and paradise in the next world. And they say for 1,000 years this was true. Islam was winning. Now true, the Christians mobilized the Crusades, but they say, we defeated the Crusades. But they say, but now we're losing. And why is that? And their answer is really breathtakingly simple. They say we are losing now because we have stopped following the will of Allah. We have lapsed from the true faith. We have allowed, if you will, the infidel, we have allowed Western influence to permeate our societies. We allow these puppet regimes propped up by American and Western influence to rule us. We allow our culture to be contaminated with Western influence. We allow American troops into the holy ground of Mecca. So what we need to do is push all of that out. Get the American troops out, overthrow these puppet regimes, unify the Muslim world against, if you will, the great Satan. Now, I mention this in part to suggest that what we are seeing is a once great civilization that is in a way now fallen down and trying to understand and account for and perhaps strike out against this perceived enemy. But I don't think that we can simply rest by, if you will, psychoanalyzing Islamic civilization. You have to look at the arguments that are made not just by the Muslims but by others against American society, against American foreign policy, and against American culture and American morality, and also against American freedom. Now, in a sense, what I'm saying is the debate with Islam is part of a larger debate, a debate over America's role in the world. Because American ideas, American influence has been really for the past several decades now spreading through the world. Not just American technology, not just American political institutions, but also American ideas, American humor, American culture. And there's a great debate about that. So I thought I would say a few words about that debate. What is it that the enemies of America say about America? And what are we to think about their arguments? One of the arguments, of course, that is made against America in the Arab world is the argument against American foreign policy. And the argument here is we don't object to what America is, but we do object to what America does. America has become a kind of empire, like traditional empires. And what it does is what empires do, which is bully and push around the rest of the world. And what's particularly galling, the Muslims say about this, and interestingly the Islamic arguments are echoed here in America, is what's particularly galling is unlike traditional empires, America does this while invoking the noble language of liberty and freedom and democracy. But in reality, the Muslims believe, and the critics say, America acts out of self-interest. It says it's against dictatorships, but it's perfectly happy to support dictators. It supported Somoza, Nicaragua, the Shah of Iran, Marcos in the Philippines. Right now, the United States is allied with at least 3 unelected regimes in the Muslim world. Musharraf in Pakistan, the royal family in Saudi Arabia, Hosni Mubarak in Egypt. So this is an attack on American foreign policy and on America's actions in the world. What is one to think about this kind of attack? I think there is a legitimate debate about to what degree should America be in the world a kind of champion or, to use the ruthless word, enforcer of liberty. But I do want to say that America today seems to be the sole champion, the sole evangelist, if you will, for the idea of liberty, for the Western idea of liberty, which the Europeans to some degree have set aside or given up on. We are, if you will, the last best hope for liberty. This is not to say that we should always promote it or we should always act to enforce it, but if we don't, who will? Who will? I would agree that American foreign policy is rooted in self-interest, as it should be. In a democratic society, we pick leaders to do what? To protect our interests, domestically and one would hope abroad as well. The legitimate question to ask of American foreign policy is, in protecting America's self-interest, is America also advancing the larger cause of freedom? Is it also advancing larger humanitarian ideals? And I think if we look at the record objectively over the past 10 or 20 or 50 years, American foreign policy has advanced the idea of liberty. We brought democracy at the point of a bayonet, to be sure, to Japan and Germany after World War II. We got into World War II for self-interest, but I think we left the world a lot better. The Cold War was another great campaign, if you will, to advance the idea of freedom through the world. The United States, I think, has invaded Afghanistan, and the result has been that the Afghanis are better off. This is not to say Afghanistan is a democracy. I suppose to some degree it's still a society ruled by warlords. Somebody said on television, we have taken Afghanistan from the 8th century and left it in the 11th century. But that's progress. And similarly, whatever the arguments about Iraq, I think it seems hard to argue that the Iraqis are worse off. They clearly are better off than they were under Hussein. So in advancing our interests, we have time after time, I think, objectively, left the world a lot better. This by way of a brief preface to American foreign policy. I now want to turn in conclusion to the third area in which the world has changed. And it is an area in which I think the Islamic attack on American society is the fiercest. See, when the Muslims jump up and down and say, America is the great Satan, we're tempted to dismiss it as a sort of boilerplate rhetoric on the part of guys who don't have jobs. But I think behind this accusation, the great Satan, is a kind of insight. Now, what the Muslims are saying, if you recall, even in the Christian tradition, Satan wasn't a conqueror, he was a tempter. And in a sense, what the Muslims are saying is that the great threat, the great challenge from America isn't simply one of American troops, formidable though those may be. It's really the threat of the American idea, the American virus, if you will, spreading throughout the world and winning, seducing, taking over the minds, particularly of young Muslims. So what is this American idea that the Muslims are so frightened about? Well, part of it, I think, is the very powerful American idea of the self-directed life. If one were to define a core idea in America, it's the idea of a life in which we are, the individual is the architect of his own destiny. Our major decisions in life, where to live, who to love, who to marry, what to believe, what to become, what religion to practice. I mean, there have been many assaults on liberty in this country, but for the most part, those major decisions remain in the private domain. The individual, black or white, rich or poor, still decides how his or her life is going to be lived on the biggest questions of all. And this idea of the self-directed life, which really we take for granted in this country, is a quite radical idea abroad. And it's a very radical idea in the Muslim world. I mean, think about it. It's saying to the Islamic wife or son, You don't have to follow the male head of the household. You don't have to follow the teachings of the Sharia, the holy law, or the mullahs, or maybe not even Allah. You are in the driver's seat of your own life. It's a threatening idea. But I also want to mention something that has happened within America in the past few decades that has made this American idea even more threatening, even more radical, to the point where the change that we have seen is divisive and controversial even here in America. I think one thing we've seen since the 1960s is a moral revolution in American society that has taken the idea of liberty beyond anything that the American founders believed. I would summarize it this way. The American founders believed in three types of freedom: economic freedom, political freedom, freedom of thought and expression, and religion. But the American founders also took it for granted that there is a moral order in the universe that is external to us, that makes claims on us. It is our job, if you will, to live up to follow the dictates of this moral order. Now, you might debate the content of that moral order, the Ten Commandments, or the American prescriptions to go when your country calls. But the point is, very few people in the society question the existence of such an order. There was a sort of moral consensus about it that persisted through World War II. I think what has happened since the 1960s in this country is that the idea of this external moral order no longer commands the assent of the society at large. The moral consensus has dissolved. This is not to say there's been a total rejection of morality. I'm not even saying that there's been a rise of relativism in the radical sense. No. What has happened is that the source of morality in America today is no longer seen, particularly by young people, as external. It is now seen as primarily internal. In other words, morality has shifted from the external order to the inner self. The inner self is now seen as the adjudicator and indeed the source of morality. If you're trying to make a decision like, do I, Sarah, love Bill? Or what should I do with my life? Should I become a writer, or should I become a lawyer? How do you decide? How do you choose? You don't choose by asking your parents to decide for you, or your teachers, or your preachers, maybe not even God. You decide by digging within yourself, by looking to that inner compass inside of you to adjudicate definitively how you should live your life. So I guess what I'm saying is that to the American founders' list of freedoms, economic freedom, political freedom, freedom of thought and expression, we now have a new freedom, which could be called moral freedom. Freedom from an external moral order. And this notion has now become very powerful in American society. And as I will say, it's also immensely controversial. Many people around the world don't even understand what it means. And as an immigrant, I confess to some ambivalence about this change, but I can't deny that it affects me. Some years ago, I went to my dad and approached him about the idea of being a writer. I said, Dad, I'm thinking of becoming a writer. And he said, well, I think you should do something useful with your life. And he wanted me to, go to business school, go to law school. And I was trying to justify the idea of being a writer, and I said, well, Dad, I realize it might be more prudent for me to go to law school or business school, but, I feel called to be a writer. I have this inner sense of calling. I was appealing to this American idea of authenticity, of the inner self. And my dad listened very politely, and after a while he said, well, Dinesh, what you seem to be saying is that there's a little being that lives inside of you. Let's call him Little Dinesh. You apparently converse with this person. And as I listened to him talk I realized it wasn't that he disagreed with me. He didn't know what the heck I was talking about. So these American ideas, which have become powerful in our culture, are alien, and I would say to some degree even subversive in the rest of the world. where does this leave us as defenders of freedom, as conservatives? Now, to some degree, there's always a temptation, particularly in a conference like this, to a kind of extreme pessimism. And yet, I think that if we were to sit around, let's say in 1980, when Reagan was first elected, and say, what would it mean for libertarians and conservatives to do well over the next 2 decades, to succeed? And we were to make a list of what objectives we could reasonably have accomplished. I want to suggest that we have, in some ways, outstripped those expectations. Who would have thought that the great and formidable Soviet Empire would come crashing down? Who would have thought that the great debate of the 20th century, the debate that Reagan mobilized his life against, the idea of collectivism, would be intellectually discredited? So we have seen great changes. Now, there remain formidable battles. There's an old Indian saying, after crossing the mountain, more mountains. And I think as political activists, you kind of know the feeling. So what then is the mission of conservatives, and particularly young conservatives, in a new situation? The world today is different from the one that Reagan faced. I think our new challenge is to articulate and defend the morality of capitalism against its enemies. I think our job is to stand up for the American idea of freedom, not just at home, but also abroad. We are the last best hope of freedom, and we do need to defend it, not just at our borders, but I would argue also beyond them. And finally, I think our job is, within America, to vindicate the idea of freedom by showing that freedom isn't just an end in itself. See, to some degree, the Islamic enemies of America say, you believe in freedom, but we believe in virtue. And to the degree that we agree with them, yes, we believe in freedom, you believe in virtue, we are two ships passing in the night. But I think that freedom, while to some degree being its own justification, is also a school of virtue. Freedom is a way of learning from one's mistakes. Freedom is also, by the way, the prerequisite to virtue. You can't have virtue without freedom. If a woman in Afghanistan or Iran is required to wear a veil, in my opinion, she is not modest, because she is being forced, she is being compelled. So our answer to the Muslim world isn't that you believe in the good society and we believe in doing what you feel like doing. It is that you believe in virtue and we believe in virtue too, but to us freedom is the way to achieve virtue. It is the prerequisite to it. So I guess what I'm saying is that the mission, I think, of conservatives and libertarians isn't just to defend freedom as a procedure, but to defend freedom for the kind of society, prosperous, self-reliant, that it produces. A long time ago, on the eve of the Glorious Revolution, the poet John Milton looked ahead and saw a society in great transformation. And one may say that his job as a conservative was to see and to defend and to fight for the new emerging society that he saw coming out of the age of tyranny and the age of oppression. I think as conservatives we are in something of a similar situation. A new world is being born, very different from the one that Reagan faced. And in a way, the truest way to live up to Reaganite ideals isn't just to chant the Reaganite mantras of 25 years ago. It is to apply the principles of Reaganism, if you will, to help bring about a society in which liberty and virtue and prosperity will all flourish. This would be the vindication of Reaganism. This would be the triumph of the conservative revolution. If it may not be a revolution, but it certainly is glorious. Thank you very much. I'm delighted to answer some questions, and let's begin right here.
First of all, Mr. D'Souza, I greatly appreciate, as everybody else in this room does, all that you've done in the name of liberty. Your books and your writings have just been amazing. I'm a little bit concerned, though, by one thing that you said here today. Looking back at World War II, the entire world looked around. They saw that we stayed out of it for 2 years and 3 months, and that we had a moral legitimacy to do what we had to do in Japan and in Germany to end World War II. If we look at the Cold War, as you pointed out in your book about Reagan and in Peter Schweitzer's book, Reagan's War, we were looking at an enemy with 45,000 nuclear weapons, intent on using them at various times. And yet Reagan, without firing a shot, without an invasion, without having to send anybody over to the Soviet Union, Reagan was able to use the moral legitimacy of capitalism and liberty to help defeat the Soviet Union from within. So when you address Iraq, it may very well be true that the Iraqi people are better off than they were before, but perception is reality. And if the world looks at us, especially in light of this prisoner scandal, which they're going to be able to use for 50 or 100 years to recruit new terrorists, if the world looks at us as not having the same moral legitimacy to go into Iraq because we weren't attacked first, and now we appear to be occupiers, doesn't that reduce our ability to spread liberty in that world that needs it so much?
The question, in a sense, gets to I think, a real libertarian dilemma, which is to say, should America be an example of freedom abroad, or, if you will, should America act to achieve freedom abroad, an enforcer of freedom abroad, to put it in a strong sense? To put it somewhat differently, is force legitimate to achieve freedom? On the surface of it, it seems obviously not. It seems something contradictory in using force to bring about freedom, until we remember that through history, almost always, freedom has been achieved through force. Freedom was achieved through force in this country. We had a revolution. Revolutions are by definition not legal. And the revolution was achieved through force. The enemies of the revolution were hung. African Americans achieved their freedom in this country through a civil war. It took force again, here, twice in this country to achieve freedom. In World War II, Japan and Germany would not have had, I think, a natural evolution towards freedom. And not only have we seen force successfully achieve freedom in both those countries, we have seen something else which I think would have seemed impossible. Cultural transformation that has accompanied this enforcement by force. I mean, look at Japan, traditionally a culture, feudal, hierarchical, a culture of samurai swordsmen. Who would have thought that that kind of a culture could have been transformed into something relatively pacific, relatively commercial, largely capitalistic? I mean, we have taken the samurai swordsman, the culture of samurai swordsmen, and transformed it into a culture of photographers. And that gives me some optimism about cultural change. Now, with regard to the scandal about the humiliation of, I mean, yes, there's a line in Measure for Measure in which Shakespeare says, "Oh, it is wonderful to have a giant's strength, but tyrannous to use it like a giant." And I think that the power is always liable to be abused. One of our libertarian lessons that applies is whatever the government does, it does badly. And that's often true of the Defense Department, just as it is true of the DMV and the Immigration Department and the other organizations. So abuse is, to some degree, intrinsic to government. I think we have to be aware of that, and this is why I think the founders were wise to put a framework of checks and balances to create that kind of accountability. It's our job as conservatives to nourish that and make sure that, when we talk about spreading democracy, we have to realize we're spreading an idea that is a mixed blessing. And that we're spreading an idea that itself needs to be qualified. We don't just mean democracy, we mean separation of powers, checks and balances, minority rights. And the interesting thing is, in the Muslim world, a lot of the Muslim radicals have learned to love democracy. They know that democracy means that in many countries, they win. Free elections in Pakistan, you think Musharraf is going to be re-elected? Free elections in Saudi Arabia, you think the gang of the 3,000 thieves is going to make it? No. But what's happening in the Muslim world and now in Iraq is a recognition that democracy doesn't just mean democracy. It means other stuff. So they read the new Iraqi constitution. They say, democracy, oh, that sounds good. But then in small print, you know, you can't massacre the Kurds. And the Shiites are like, well, what's this? What's the fun of being a majority if you can't massacre the Kurds? So, yes.
I have two questions. Firstly, it's related to the one that the gentleman before me said, that when you're talking about the Iraqis and Afghans now being better off than being worse off, what it sounded to me was that the end justifies the means. To give you an example, for instance, we as libertarians want education for all, but we will advocate private vouchers, whereas the government or the socialists would advocate more government spending. The goals are the same, but the means are completely opposite. And the same thing in environment, in poverty, in every other area. So my question is, if you just measure it by people being worse off or better off, aren't the ends justifying the means? That's the first question. And secondly, America to us, I mean, I'm from India, so it's always been an ideal of rule of law. You know, every individual has access to the justice system, which is not the case in our country. But America's foreign policy somehow doesn't follow a pattern of rule of law. You know, it's more dictatorial than following a due process. So is there some way in which the internal pattern of rule of law and a good justice system that is followed internally in the US can somehow be followed in an international order as well?
Yes. With regard to the ends justifying the means, I mean, if the ends don't justify the means, I don't know what does. In trying to use means, you have to look at what the end is. Now, you mentioned international law and the idea of law more generally. I think that within America, law achieves its legitimacy through consent, through the consent of the governed. Now, arguably that consent has been somewhat eroded or diluted, but the truth of it is we still have the power to kick the bad guys out, at least once every 4 years. In that sense, consent remains a liberal idea that is intact in American society. It remains the basis for liberal legitimacy. To me, the problem is that when you go abroad into the international sphere, there is no comparable idea of consent. You have the United Nations, but it's made up of a kind of motley mixture of free and despotic regimes. Where does its legitimacy come from? You have large countries and small countries. It's a strange mixture, and it invokes ideas of very dubious legitimacy. Sovereignty. You know, before the Iraq war, the big issue was you can't invade the sovereignty of another country. And then you step back and say, well, let's look at what this means. What does sovereignty mean? How did Hussein come to power? Came to power by force, through the barrel of a gun. He stayed in power through force. And so what moral right did Hussein have to rule? None. So what moral objection is there to a third power stepping in and pushing someone who has no moral right to rule out? None. Now you might say, well, wait a minute, Dinesh, are you saying that the United States has the moral right to kick out and evacuate and displace all the despotic and tyrannical regimes in the world? Yes. Of course we do. Now, whether we do it is an issue of prudence. We have to ask, what is the cost? What is the risk? What is the danger? How many lives are we jeopardizing? What will the backlash be? What will our friends think? Those are prudential questions. But on the root issue, it seems to me that the idea of sovereignty is no valid objection to the idea that liberty itself justifies the end. Liberty justifies the means, which is to say the use of force, to allow the Iraqi people, rather than Hussein, to determine the destiny of Iraq. Yes.
Good morning. My name is Jim Johnston. I'm with the Heartland Institute in Chicago. And in Chicago, we have a community that consists mainly of Indians and Pakistanis. They have restaurants that serve both groups. They have clothing stores that serve both groups. The children play on the same soccer teams. And the question I have for you is, why do Indians and Pakistanis in Chicago live in peace with one another, whereas they can't live in peace in their native areas?
The question is, why do people, and this is true not just of India or Pakistan, but all over the world, that you have people fighting in Northern Ireland, fighting in Palestine, and yet the Israeli and Palestinian who work at the software company up in Palo Alto get along famously well. How is this possible? I think to understand that, you have to look at one of the incredibly radical and yet amazingly successful projects of the American founding, which was that the American founders were haunted by the religious wars in Europe, and they decided that, look, ultimately this is a contest of competing revelations. There is no way to arbitrate that kind of dispute. What we need to do is to lower man's sights and to focus his energies on something other than what Hobbes called spirits invisible. And so the American founders said, well, what is a human impulse that is just as strong as religion, that can provide, if you will, a diversion from the wars of religion? And the American founders came up with a candidate. And that, of course, is commerce. Samuel Johnson says somewhere, men are never so harmlessly occupied as when they are making money. And the idea here is very simple, that, you know, if you are saving for the weekend, if you are planning a large addition to your kitchen, if you're trying to build up for retirement, you're not going to be the kind of guy who wants to go around spearing your neighbors. So the American temperament has developed very differently than the temperament in other parts of the world, and that's why ancestral and ethnic, in a way, the American solution for religious conflict is the same as the American solution for ethnic and racial conflict. It is the idea of shifting attention away from blood and tribe and ethnicity and faith, and more toward individual freedom, more toward prosperity, more toward entrepreneurship and commerce as productive and useful activity. I mean, historically, if you look at the merchant and the entrepreneur, have in every society, ours included, been condemned. In the Hindu caste system, the merchant is at the bottom, one step from the untouchable on the caste system at the bottom. Confucius says that the moral man is concerned with nobility, the low man is concerned with making money. In the Muslim tradition, the Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun, he says that even looting is morally preferable to commerce. Why? Because he says it's more manly. He says that essentially, at least in looting, you have to beat your opponent in open contest and take his stuff. And he says commerce is essentially effeminate. Buying and selling a bunch of stuff, it's disgraceful. So what the American founders did is they accomplished a moral revolution in which the entrepreneur is moved from the bottom of the totem pole to the top. And by the way, this is why a lot of professors are anti-American, because they don't like the results of this moral revolution. They would like to live in a society where the priest or the elite, I mean, they believe that capitalism is unmeritocratic. They believe in a truly just society, a lot of professors do. In a truly just society, the most intelligent guys themselves would have the most money and the most power. And so they are inherently biased against a capitalist system which makes the entrepreneur and not the intellectual the cultural icon and assigns the greatest rewards. Not that intellectuals live poorly, but the sociology professor making $72,000 a year, living relatively well, is still a little disgusted to see some overweight Rotarian with a gold chain on his chest making $1.5 million selling, you know, term life insurance or pest control products. I mean, it's embarrassing. Yes.
Hi, Mr. D'Souza. You're talking about democracy, morals, and the ends justify the means. I would like to know your view on, first, democracy, when it's ruled by the people, correct? And how would you justify when the statement can be said that it could be also the rule, the tyranny of the majority, in which 51% of the people say that it's right? Does that mean it's right? And what about the minority? And the morality inherent in that? And secondly, when is force the means to an end if, say, like in our country today, we are slowly losing our freedoms, say, via the Patriot Act, while we are trying to also, again, as the previous two questionnaires asked, we're trying to export it. Where's the basis with that?
Your question is about the ends and the means and the Patriot Act and so on. Look, coming back to this issue of the ends and the means. I mean, if I'm sitting peacefully in my study and someone kicks in the door and they jump in, I don't know the guy, but he wants to kill me. I reach into my drawer, I pull out a gun, I shoot him. Now, I don't know the guy. Ordinarily, I wouldn't have shot him. But I'm choosing this reprehensible means of shooting him to achieve an end, which is to say to protect my life and security. So the ends justify the means. Now, I agree that the means have to be proportioned to the ends. I agree that the ends don't justify any means. That's a little bit of what, I mean, one could argue that you know, there's nothing wrong with torturing Al-Qaeda prisoners, and then you can debate, do the ends, getting information, justify the means? But I guess what I'm trying to get at here is that as defenders of liberty, you always have to look and see, are we advancing or undermining the idea that we care about? And then evaluate the means proportionately. In the Civil War, for example, I know this is a controversial topic, but Lincoln, in suspending habeas corpus, was challenged and said, you know, you're undermining liberty. And Lincoln said, look, the fate of the Union, i.e. the fate of liberty itself, the fate of a self-governing society is at stake. Do you want me to send the ship down in the name of protecting this one right, at the end of which is we may have habeas corpus, but we don't have a United States? Or in wartime, am I allowed to temporarily suspend this liberty in order that this larger collection of liberties can be sustained? Now, I'm not giving the answer to that. I'm not a Civil War expert, but I'm saying it's a legitimate question for defenders of liberty to differ on. Similarly here, what we have to say is, look, you know, are we threatened as a society? Can a free society defend itself against this kind of threat, a different kind of threat? Traditional ideas of deterrence and so on may not apply that well. I mean, Bush in his speech on Iraq said, look, the reason we have to consider preemption is because we're in a new situation. The old idea was, look, only fight when the other guy attacks first. The idea was, let the other guy hit you in the stomach or on the jaw. It might hurt, but then fight back. And in general, I think that's a prudent and wise idea. But what if the other guy has a nuclear weapon? Then the situation, Bush says, changes. Preemption, otherwise unthinkable, now becomes justifiable. If we had known about 9/11 6 months before, wouldn't we have preempted? Wouldn't we have acted to prevent it? Shouldn't we have? Of course we should. Now, I think in all these situations you have to, also traditional deterrence, by the way, was based on the assumption of mutual rationality. We tell the Soviet Union, you have a lot of nuclear weapons, we have a lot of nuclear weapons. Don't think of blowing up San Francisco or Chicago, we'll take out Moscow and Leningrad. And that logic, slightly perverse, but nevertheless held together reasonably well for a half century. Today it may operate with regard to China or with regard to North Korea. But you can't tell that kind of thing to bin Laden. You can't say to bin Laden, look, don't think of taking out New York, you know, we'll take out Riyadh. His answer would be, well, when do we start? Last question.
Okay. Dinesh, you documented how our foreign policy and probably exportation of our culture has made us the great Satan in the Islamic world. And to that extent, Does that not then serve as a driving force for keeping those Islamic regimes in a coherent position? And might not we be better off in the long term if some of those irritants were removed, if we allowed the Islamic societies to build a insular, secular society, and might they not implode of that their own internal weight in a more humane and liberty-oriented mode than trying to go in and force them to be free?
The question was about this sort of provocative idea of forcing someone to be free. I think we have to realize that what we're trying to impose, and I wouldn't shy away from the word impose, is something different than what traditional empires have tried to impose. We're trying to impose not so much a society as we are trying to impose a mechanism. We're trying to impose on Iraq when you think of science, democracy, and capitalism, ultimately they're mechanisms. They're mechanisms for filtering information, like what do people want to buy or sell. They're ways of allowing a society to allow the voice of its people to be expressed in what products are made or in what its politicians say and sometimes do. So I guess what I'm saying is, to say to Iraq, we are imposing democracy on you, is only a way of saying we are imposing a mechanism on you that is going to allow the Iraqi people's will to express itself. Now you might say, well, what if the Iraqi people don't want democracy? What if they vote against it? Well, there's inherently a problem with people who have, although freely come to power and said we'll have elections, but we'll have elections one time and never again. Khomeini was probably the most popular guy in Iran in 1980. He would have won a free election, but having won it, he never held another free one. Today, arguably, the Islamic mullahs in Iran would have a very hard time winning the election. So elections doesn't mean have it once, and if you decide against it, stop having them. It's a mechanism for continually expressing the people's will. Now, can we do it? I don't know. We're trying to introduce a new thing into a part of the world that has never known it. It's a gamble, I admit it. But if it succeeds, we can see a transformation no less spectacular than the transformation of the old Soviet Union. So does this justify some expenditure of time and resources and patience and will? I think yes, when we realize that the fate of freedom in the world depends on us. I don't think that these societies, I mean, societies, when you say implode, they fester. They become, look at Beirut. Beirut has imploded, and as a result, it's one of the most chaotic societies on earth, destabilizing and creating chaos around it. Look at the Congo. It's a disaster zone in Africa that is basically spreading the tentacles of confusion, chaos, destabilization, to all the countries around it. So this festering is not just a matter of them imploding in the sense of going away. It's in the sense of creating a lawless environment in which bandits and bad guys and terrorists all meet and fester, in which the laboratories once run by governments are now taken over by semi-feudal organizations that can then plot and do with them what they, it's a nasty brew. So let me back up for a moment and say what, as conservatives, I would say conservatives and libertarians, there's sometimes these clashes. But the clashes should be mitigated by the understanding that as conservatives, we're not conservatives in the European or ancient sense. We're not defenders of throne and altar. What are we conserving in America? The American Revolution. The American Revolution is a liberal idea. So we conservatives in America are conservers of liberalism. Liberalism in the classic sense. What is our goal in the Middle East? Loosely speaking, to convert Muslims into liberals. Now, we don't want them to be liberals in the sense of Michael Dukakis. I think that would be a harsh fate even for bin Laden. But we want to be, I think, defenders of liberty. See, the American Revolution is not only for us. The Declaration of Independence says not just all Americans, but all men are created equal. And so there's a certain sense in which there's a universalism built into it. the universalism should be governed by prudence in the way we achieve it. But I would suggest that to be a true conservative and a true libertarian is to be a defender of liberty, not just as an American, but as a universal ideal. Thank you very much.
This event was part of the 2004 Freedom Fest, sponsored by Young America's Foundation. For more information, visit their website at yaf.org. Now from the